from 9 to 4 in Wells. There's a complimentary lunch with one of the alumni, so you're all invited to that. Of course, we're having it at Madison on the 25th, the Friday 25th. On Monday, we're having a discussion of the play Indecent, and they're complimentary copies on the second floor of C. Wells, if you'd like to join that book discussion. And then on the 18th, we're having Doris Bergen give our annual Holocaust lecture in the auditorium in Kellogg on sexual violence during the Holocaust. And I think on April 25th, there's going to be excerpts of actors and actresses reading from performing parts of the play Indecent in the Residential College of Arts and Humanities auditorium. And then there's the Stostakhovich concert, the 27th and 28th, one's in Detroit, one's here in the Wharton Center with our own James Madison College Holocaust Studies Chair, Amy Simon, giving a preview lecture before the concert, as well as Matt Hawley in history and in the Serling Institute. So there's lots of stuff going on, and there's also, for those of you who are minoring in Jewish studies or thinking of minoring in Jewish studies, there's a checklist and the 36 courses or so that count for the minor that are being offered next year in the back if you're still checking things out. I know some of you are almost graduating, but I just thought I'd give you that spiel before we get started. So, Israeli politics are never, there's never a dull moment. There's always interesting things to talk about, and I think I'll start off with, of course, you all know that there were Israeli elections being held yesterday. Many of you know, I'll just start with just a couple very basics, since some of you follow Israeli politics really closely, others of you don't. That, of course, Israel is a parliamentary democracy where you often might have 12 to 20 parties, political parties, competing against each other in an election, and it's done proportionally, right? So it used to be that you just need 1% of the vote in order to support to form a political party in Israel, which was one of the lowest thresholds in the world. And in that respect, in some ways, makes Israel extremely democratic for people to be able to gain representation by just having 1% of the vote representing them. Right before the 2015 election, the threshold was raised, and has been raised several times, from 2.5% to 3.25%. So now you need, so when we'll talk about how these parties right now haven't met the 3.25%, is why they won't necessarily get seats in the new Knesset or parliament, right? So in that sense, it's always the case where an Israeli political party, unlike in the United States, never wins the majority vote of the population, ever, right? So when we talk about all this support for the current Prime Minister Netanyahu, on one hand, he has a strong base of support, and in a way it's incredible that it looks like the likelihood is that he's going to be Prime Minister again, and we'll talk about that. But in a way it's also good for you to keep in back of your mind that really about 25% of the population voted for him, right? So you might make all these assessments and conclusions about what this means about the country, what this means about Israelis and what they believe, and try to interpret that, but with losing the perspective that it's actually an extremely diverse society, right? With people who are secular, people who are Orthodox, people who are ultra-Orthodox, and diversity of ideologies and opinions and backgrounds, and non-Jews and Jews and Druze and Palestinian Israelis and Bedouins and people that originally came in from Libya and Ethiopia and Morocco and Poland and Germany, right? It's an extremely diverse in so many ways, including one's political opinions. And as our country is getting more and more polarized, as we can see, and our elections in the United States have been so incredibly close in the past few elections, and you have all these talk about culture wars and divisions within the country and heated, politics. Well, in some ways, Israel has been that kind of polarized place, perhaps for even longer. And this election season was also incredibly fraught with heightening polarization within the country during the election campaign, right? So, but you can see that we have two front runners who were neck and neck in the election, who each got a percentage of the vote, which is around 25% of the vote, that would give them 35 seats in a 120-seat Knesset, right? And so they both right now, they're about 97% of the votes have been counted. As you've probably read, there's still about 250,000 votes to be counted today and tomorrow that include people who work for embassies around the world, soldiers, people in hospitals, right? So things might still change a bit. It's theoretically possible that Gantz could pull ahead, perhaps of this. I think Netanyahu right now is about 1,200 votes more than Gantz, but both equivalent to 35 seats each, right? So in that sense, on one hand, it's a really strong statement about the continuing popularity of Netanyahu, at least amongst 25% of the population that is its strong base, even after corruption scandals and after talk that he'll actually have to go to a hearing starting July 10th for accusations against him of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. So even despite those accusations, he gets these number of seats. On one hand, people in the Likud are celebrating, right? But on the other hand, here you have a brand new political kind of alignment of the blue and white alignment that was just formed even within the past 3 months, that includes a party that's relatively new to the past elections, yes indeed, a centrist party. But Gantz is brand new on the scene, right? As a politician, he was an IDF chief. So on one hand, it's also kind of incredible the showing that he brought in this election when the party and that political alignment didn't even exist 3 months ago. He wasn't really preparing for it. He didn't say much actually until 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And so in that sense, it's an incredible showing in terms of this brand new central alignment. So I'm going to talk kind of a little more historically, but of course what's happening now, as you've probably read about, is they're going to count these 250,000 votes. And then probably next week, the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, is going to ask all these parties to come to his White House, or his president's home maybe, and they all have to talk to him about who they would support in a coalition, right? And whoever Reuven Rivlin thinks, right, because they're singularly have the same amount of votes, right? So then it depends who can get, and neither of them has enough Knesset seats to actually form a coalition, right? So they all depend on additional parties to form a coalition. And so which parties can convince the president, which is a more ceremonial role in Israel, but has this incredible power in this instance, which parties can influence the president to say, Netanyahu, you go first in trying to form a coalition, and then you have 6 weeks or so to form a coalition, or Gantz. And it seems like things are aligned that it'll be easier for Netanyahu to do. So that seems the likelihood, but it's not 100% guaranteed, right? And I'll go through with you later in my lecture about these different political parties and where they stand and who's up and who's down and what are some of the coalitions that can be formed and what impact this may have on domestic Israeli society, Israeli foreign policy, cleavages within the society, and so forth, right? But I think I first want to take a step back and talk about kind of the polarization in Israeli society. My dad sitting here is also a senior scholar, retired of Israel Studies, and he wrote a book, Visions and Divisions in Israel, about the polarization in Israeli society. But that's the first thing I think to recognize, that everyone on one hand talks about this big rightward shift in Israel over the past decade. And if you look at the blocks right now, you certainly witness a rightward shift in some respects. But on the other hand, if you look at it another way, basically all the center and center-right parties that form the right bloc and the center-left parties that form the left bloc arguably have been relatively stable for at least a decade in a very polarized society. So in that sense, we have not seen a dramatic shift from election to election. We might see a shift in certain parties gaining more seats, certain parties gaining less seats. But I would argue, and I'd love to get your opinions in our discussion part, that to some extent, even though you have shifts within the blocs and the formation of new parties and new factions within the blocs, they have remained relatively stable over time, kind of explaining these close elections that are hard to call each time in the past few years, in the past dozen years or so at least. So I want to talk a little bit about, first, the challenges to Netanyahu, right? He has 4 straight terms in office as prime minister. How can we explain that, and why haven't some of the other parties been able to sufficiently challenge him, right? What are some of the things going on in terms of that inability to be challenged? And I think one of the explanations, perhaps, in terms of the center-left, even though they've been an almost even bloc over many years, why they haven't been able to assume power, is that the ideological differences between the left and the right have diminished over time in Israel. Where it used to be, maybe, let's say, if we look at the election of 1992, you have Yitzhak Rabin of the Labor Party saying he's going to achieve peace with the Palestinians within a year, and running on that as the first priority of his election platform on one hand, and on the other hand you have Yitzhak Shamir from the Likud party saying he's not going to give an inch of the West Bank, etc. Right? Very clear opposing ideologies, and that has been very much blurred in the last years, which I think contributes to the difficulty for the center-left to differentiate itself from the growing center parties, right? And if you look at the election in the past month, one of Gantz's challenges, and the challenge of the center-left, is because you have this right and left blocs, the only way for him to really move ahead past Netanyahu is to not only stick to votes within the center-left bloc, but to get votes from the center-right, right? That's the only way he can really shift things around. And what tended to happen is, therefore, because he's trying to get people from the center-right, he's also alienating people from the real left, because he's kind of blurring the boundaries between right and left. And so this is one of the things that's made it challenging for parties in the left and center-left, is they have to deal with, on one hand, and you see this, by the way, right, to a certain extent, with our own Democratic Party in the United States right now, where you have some people saying, no, the way to win is you have to get the center, etc., and others saying, no, you have to have kind of an ideologically pure, different stance that's very different, right? And to what extent you move to try to get center votes to win, and to what extent you differentiate yourself from the opposition ideologically, is something that every country is struggling with, and that the center-left parties in Israel are struggling with as well. And that's part of the issue that's been a problem over the years. And you have also, what makes it more difficult is that in this differentiation among the parties, is that the Labor Party, which of course was the dominant party in the first 30 years of Israel's existence and was a major party, and now, if you look, only has six seats, right? And part of that is some of the things I'm going to give you a political context for now, but part of that is that a lot of Labor Party supporters wanted to strategically vote for Gantz, because he had the best chance. He had to get, you need to get the most votes in order to have a chance of being called by the president to form a coalition. And so if Labor doubled its size, it still wouldn't necessarily make that difference. So a lot of people strategically would rather vote for Labor, voted for Gantz and the center party, saying the main issue in the election is to beat Netanyahu, and what's the best way to beat Netanyahu, right? And it's a completely different situation in the US, but one can't help having some some kind of analogies to what's going on in the US right now, with people either kind of really loving Trump or hating Trump, and it kind of being a referendum on Trump to some extent in the next American election. Well, that's what happened in the Israeli election, right? His base really loves him. You have other people who despise him in Israel, and it was really a referendum about him personally and his leadership primarily in the election, and that was the strategic move on the part of a lot of the center-left to vote for the center party. But what happened to Labor, if you want to kind of move back a little bit and say, why has the center-left not been able to defeat or challenge Netanyahu more sufficiently in the past few years? Part of it is, of course, the whole peace process and the violence in the suit and how many Israelis interpret it, right? So many Israelis think that they their prime ministers gave generous offers for peace, and that was one of the things that distinguished the Labour Party over years from the Likud, was that it's felt that it urgently has to pursue peace with the Palestinian Authority towards a two-state solution. And during the Camp David negotiations under Bill Clinton in 2000, for instance, Barack said, who had been willing to withdraw from most of the West Bank and most of East Jerusalem, that Arafat was not a partner for peace. And then you had Bill Clinton, who initially had promised both parties during the peace negotiations that he wouldn't blame any party, then publicly putting all the blame on Arafat as not being a partner for peace and praising Ehud Barak for having been a brave, courageous leader. So, right, so if you're an Israeli, and I think the truth is much more complicated than that, of course, but if you're an Israeli citizen, and by the way, from Israeli standards in 1999-2000, Ehud Barak had won by a landslide in Israeli standards, right, and had been the most decorated military person in Israel's history. So here you have him saying, I did my best, I was willing to withdraw from most of East Jerusalem with the West Bank, and Arafat's just not ready to cut a deal. And then you have Bill Clinton, who Israelis worshipped and adored, right, saying the same thing. So why wouldn't they believe it, right? So many Israelis, therefore, and I think the truth again is more complicated, but that's the narrative that they were told by Bill Clinton and by Ehud Barak, and therefore believed, right? And then right after that, you have, ensuing in 2008, you have Ehud Olmert offering, from an Israeli point of view, a more generous offer than even Barak had, which was not taken from their point of view from Mahmoud Abbas. Again, I can get into the more complicated realities and discussion time, but I'm talking about trying to understand why parties like Labor diminished in power. They had the sense that they had voted on a platform of peace, right, in 1992, in 1999, 2000, and thereafter. And then you have the second Intifada, which kind of blew the wind. So in a way, unintentionally, both Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak took the rug from out of the feet and the wind out of the sails of the Labor Party by saying there's no partner to peace. Because if there's no partner to peace, then why vote for Labor, right? Then you're going to maybe vote for right. Then you have, right, 5 years of extreme violence during the second Intifada, where there were weekly and daily suicide bombings in Israel, where 1,000 Israelis died. Israel reacted, of course, and 3,000 Palestinians died as well, so every Israeli and Palestinian knew that someone has died. But given the confluence of a belief that Israel had offered these peace deals and these weekly suicide bombings, those things in tandem also blew the wind out of the sails of the left, and many people in many countries, when they feel that their security is threatened, start voting more for the right. And this is what happened in Israel as well. Then you had the emergence of these centrist parties that thought, okay, if there's no partner, maybe we should withdraw unilaterally, right? And so then you get Ariel Sharon in 2005 saying that he's withdrawing all 8,000 settlers and all the soldiers from the Gaza Strip, and intending, before he had a stroke, to evacuate from most of the West Bank. And of course, when Israelis see that, from their point of view, Hamas has fired over 10,000 rockets on them since, with a rocket, by the way, right in election season, at a house outside of Tel Aviv, was it 10 or so days ago, that injured 3 people in their home and destroyed the house, right? So that is a reminder to people, oh, there's insecurity, there are costs to unilateral withdrawal. Even though most Israelis say they want a two-state solution, they don't see it as an urgent priority now, because they don't see, in their point of view, it happening right away in the next year with Hamas ruling the Gaza Strip. So I'm not justifying all these opinions and votes. I'm trying to explain why, right, the center left has been challenged in actually beating Netanyahu in these elections. And in confluence with that, then when he wins, he has a lot, sometimes the Labor Party or some of these centrist parties joining his government, right? Because Labor, things like Barak and the Labor Party joined his government from 2009 to 2011, hoping that they could steer things in the right direction from their point of view, and also wanting to have important positions like the defense minister. And then when some of the Labor Party said, we don't want to stay in the coalition, it's not worth it to be in a coalition with Netanyahu, 8 Labor Party members departed, and then Barak stayed in, forming a new centrist party, but again, kind of fracturing the strength of the Labor Party, right? And the same thing happened then in 2013, where Tzipi Livni, who, by the way, won the most votes in 2009 and was unable to form a coalition, I can talk about that, and Yesh Atid joined the Netanyahu government, thinking they could push it along and having promised Tzipi Livni that she could head peace negotiations with the Palestinians, again thinking they can move things along. But then when they fail to, they lose credibility in terms of being a real legitimate opposition party and a real difference to the Netanyahu government if they're in the coalition with the Netanyahu government, right? So all this helps explain why kind of the power of the center-left has been diffused through that process of constantly forming new parties. And also, by the way, fighting amongst themselves sometimes within the center-left. And if you look at the most recent election, that's what happened with both blocs. You had Netanyahu at the end, in 2015, really trying to realign the right and get votes from other parties on the right and from parties to the right of him, and therefore, in a way, smearing people that he'll end up bringing into his coalition. And the same thing happening on the center-left, where Gantz ultimately wanted to get the most votes, and then would also be putting down sometimes Labor and telling people who would vote for Labor to vote for him, right? And so that kind of politics, in a way, also weakens the strengths of other parties to the left or center-left, such as Labor and Poor Meretz, which had 5 seats and went down to 4 seats, in contrast to its heyday during the Rabin 1992 government, where I think it had 12 seats or something like that. So again, kind of diffusing the power of the center-left. And of course, so they're fighting sometimes against each other for this zero-sum votes within a center-left bloc to realign the center-left bloc, and also sometimes fighting within themselves within the party, right? So even if you look at a small party like Meretz, which is the leftmost Zionist party in Israel, that has almost always been for a two-state solution, has always been for human rights and civil rights and equality for all citizens, etc. It, sometimes has factions within it as to what extent it should remain ideologically pure as a kind of real difference to the center parties, and to what extent it needs to actually compromise and moderate itself and be more pragmatic so that it can form coalitions and actually influence things more directly as opposed to from the opposition, right? And so sometimes, like when you had in the olden days Shulamit Aloni and Yossi Sarid, who were barely on speaking terms, even within parties, you have this constant change of leadership, even within Meretz and other parties. And right now, again, because they've had disappointing results, everybody's going to call for a quick new leadership in Labor, where Gabay is later, and he'll be one to be replaced. And Tamar Meretz, people will call for her to be replaced because they only got 4 seats and so forth. And so it's this constant kind of weakening in some ways of factionalism within the party and among the parties. Another thing, if you look at the challenge of the center-left to actually replace Netanyahu in the past few years, one of the things is still, I think, a perception that the center-left is mostly Ashkenazi, or Jews who came from Europe, and that the center-right is mostly Mizrahi, or Jews that came from Middle East and North Africa, or Sephardim who were kicked out of Spain and traveled elsewhere in 1492, right? And therefore, you have a lot of identity politics going on, where hardly any Mizrahi vote for Meretz, and it's considered kind of an elitist, arrogant Ashkenazi party. And then you have this identity politics with some Mizrahim who have for decades voted for Likud out of disaffection for the Labor Party having been in power. Ashkenazim having controlled the state institutions first and been there before. A lot of the Mizrahim arrived after the establishment of the state, and feeling like they had been discriminated against or treated like second-class citizens. So now things are changing, and there's 25 percent intermarriage rate between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, but you still have this perception. And I had a couple of students, research assistants, look at how many Knesset members were Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, but Francis, who's sitting in the back, helped me with some of that. And you could see that actually, I think the truth was more complicated than the perception. In some years, a lot of the center-left parties have 50% Mizrahim representation in terms of their Knesset membership, or 30%, or sometimes in the 18th Knesset even more. But basically, there is some truth to the polarity of identity politics in terms of a long-standing perception that you vote for a right-center party if you're Mizrahi and center-left if you're Ashkenazi. The truth is much more complicated than that. And of course, Gabay is Mizrahi himself, today's head of the Labor Party, but still did not have as much success as people had hoped in appealing to expanding the base of the party to more Mizrahim. And ironically, Ashkenazi, one of the IDF chief of staffs, who is one of the four leaders of this new blue and white party, has a Mizrahi mother and was also trying to appeal to Mizrahi voters. So the truth is a little more complicated, but it's still been a little bit of a challenge. I think another challenge, although it's not the dominant theme in terms of why the center-left has had a hard time ousting Netanyahu in the last 10 years, is I think some latent sexism in Israeli political culture. A lot of the heads of certain parties, whether it be Meretz or Labor with, or Tzipi Livni with the center parties who won the most votes in 2009, still I think face this challenge. So on one hand, Israel had one of the first female prime ministers in the world with Golda Meir in the 70s. I think it has greater gender equality than most countries in the world. It has, in this Knesset it will have, and in the last Knesset it had 29 female Knesset members, which I don't think is anything to brag about, but I don't think that different from some European countries in the United States. So I don't mean to claim that somehow it's in a league of its own in terms of, but I think it's very comparable in some ways to the US. And if you look at the Hillary Clinton campaigns in 2008, 2016, some of the things she faced in terms of media coverage and journalists interrupting. I think some of you may be familiar with some of the extra challenges that perhaps she faced because of gender or that current candidates face, and that may have played a little bit of a role in the sense that one could say hypothetically as a counterfactual that perhaps we wouldn't have had the last 10 years of Netanyahu rule had she been able to form a coalition in 2009, right? Because she won the most votes in 2009, and she had an extra Knesset in 2009, but wasn't able to form the coalition. Now, on one hand, you could say it's due to her own personal mistakes, right? Because she wanted to have clean hands. The ultra-Orthodox parties, which are here, Shas, the Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox party, and the United Torah Judaism, which is the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, often the thing that they care about most, often historically in Israel, they'll align themselves with the center-left government or they'll align themselves with the center-right government. They don't necessarily care that much as long as they get the money that they would like for their health clinics, for their yeshivas, for their communities, and are taking care of their communities. So they were asking her for, I forget what it was, whether it was $800 million, probably $1 million for their institutions, and she said, I'd only give $600 million or something like that, but she didn't want to feel like they're bribing her to form the coalition, where of course, historically every party, in a way, is doing that. They're saying, if you want me in your coalition and you want my support, then I want these promises from you. I want this ministerial position for my party, and perhaps I want these funds for my institutions. So it's an unfortunate part of the game, and I think in a lot of parliamentary democracies, but she didn't want to cave in. Now, arguably, and this is where the gender comes in, since Shas only has male leaders, they only allow male leaders since it's an ultra-Orthodox party, perhaps that also affected their willingness to support a female candidate, perhaps, right? So you have other things that are going on that are influencing why the center-left had more, had greater, has had difficulty really challenging Netanyahu. And finally, I'll add one other aspect, and that is the Palestinian Israeli parties or the Arab Israeli parties, which right now are the Balad and the United Arab List that came together in this election and got 4 seats, and Hadash and Ta'al, which came together in the Senate election, got 6 seats, getting 10 seats together, which probably on average has been the amount of seats Palestinian parties have been 4 Palestinian parties historically get. But in 2015, they joined forces together in a joint Arab list, partially because the threshold for establishing a party was raised to 3.25%. And so they felt like they maybe needed to join forces. And then they got, right now, they have 13 seats in the Knesset, which is the highest they've had. And so in that sense, they might be losing 3 seats for a combination of factors that I'll quickly talk about. But their positionality makes it also difficult for the center-left to be able to form a coalition because they've never been invited into a coalition. Right, so they've had people in ministerial positions, they have someone on the Supreme Court, they have their own parties, but they feel like there's a ceiling in terms of forming a coalition government. And if you look right now, and I'll go through this with you in a little bit, arguably the center-left depends on the support of Palestinian Israeli parties in order to really say to a president, look, we can get at least 61 Knesset seats if you do the math, and I'll go through with you. Right? So one of the challenges is the polarization in society between Jews and Palestinians in order to make this happen. And on one hand, and this is very complex, and I can talk about it more in the discussion if you'd like, but on one hand, one could say that sometimes it's discrimination amongst the Jewish Zionist parties in being suspicious of them or not allowing them as a party into the coalition government. And certainly if you look at Likud politics in the 2015 election and the 2019 election, one could arguably say that there's something to that, right? In 2015, Netanyahu was saying, I think a week before the election, that, oh, Arabs are going in droves to the polls, therefore you have to vote for us, kind of a fear tactic that somehow Arab citizens are suspect, and therefore you need to have greater Jewish representation as a kind of almost prejudicial or discriminatory stance on their side. And it's so strong that even Gantz, if you look at him during this current election, was not, was kind of saying, well, not saying he would allow an Arab party into the coalition, not wanting to advertise that, and sometimes hinting at or saying directly the opposite. Why? Because he's completely dependent. He's in this bind where on one hand he needs the Palestinian Israeli parties to be able to tell the president of Israel that I have enough support among parties to form a coalition, but on the other hand he's not going to have the chance to do that unless he really beats Netanyahu in terms of having the highest support, and he can only do that given the polarized right-center blocks if he can get votes from the right. Is the only way he can do it. So if you want votes from the right, you have to be very careful about what you say about letting Palestinian parties into coalition, but if you don't do that, you're alienating them, and then they won't back you up this week when they're coming. They'll be, forget it, we're alienated, right? So on one hand, and of course this culminated this week where the Likud party actually had some of its activists use cameras in some of the polling places in Palestinian places, I would say so-called, I mean that's my subjective opinion, to guard against voter fraud. And we see this in different contexts in different places in this country, right? In terms of concerns for voter fraud and what that translates to into possible intimidation of polling sites for different populations. We had that happening this week, where certainly some Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis felt like, oh, this is an intimidation, and it may have influence, I don't think in a dramatic way, but maybe in some way voting for it. So you have this happening, right, on one hand. On the other hand, I also think, things are very complex, and you have to look at things in their entirety. Because the different Arab parties differ from each other, right? So if you look at Hadash Ta'al, they're more willing to cooperate with an Israeli government, and even told Gantz, we may contemplate backing you in, for a vote in this past month, right? So they're willing to talk about forming a government. Perhaps Hadash is officially actually a Jewish Arab Communist Party not just an Arab party, but most of its representatives and the vast majority of supporters are Arab, even though you have some Jews supporting it as well. Right? So they're in the sense of a different nature than Balad, United Arab List. Balad is a more Palestinian nationalist party that in the last election in 2015, since it was part of the joint Arab list for all four Palestinian parties, got the entire list to say, we won't join, not that we're being discriminated against, not asked to be joined, we say we refuse to join any center-left coalition, even if Herzog needed our support in order to try to form a coalition. We refuse to join a coalition, and this was motivated by a more nationalist Balad, who also in the past, some of his leaders have been accused of supporting Hezbollah or of saying things that support Hamas and Hezbollah, which are like, firecrackers in the Israeli society and politics. And even though it's completely different situations, I think in some ways I compare it to the US in election when Obama was first running for election, and his minister that he used to go to for years was saying something like he understood or even supported, I forget what the language was, but it was very understanding of the 9/11 attack.
Oh, Jeremiah Wright.
Jeremiah Wright. And then during the election, Obama had to officially distance himself, or felt like he had to officially distance himself from the minister. I think he'd gone to every Sunday for years and had married him in order to have a chance of getting elected, right? Because you can't, you can't imagine someone being like the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Foreign Affairs or the Treasury Secretary in the US who is saying, oh yes, I actually understand and agree with why our enemy would want to attack us, right? So I think in any country, this would be very provocative and complicated to say the least, and certainly that's what some Israelis would, when the Likud plays on the fear of these parties, it's usually kind of centered on Balad as being this fiery, party that, like, how could you, have a party like this in the coalition? So other parties say we refuse to have you in the coalition, and Balad itself says there's no way we would want to be part of any of the coalition. As left Zionists would be, Zionists no way, right? And then you have the United Arab List, which is a more Islamist party, which is also less likely on their own to want to join a coalition government. So on both ends, this is a challenge, but this is a challenge that eventually will have to be overcome in order, I think, for the center-left to have a greater chance, A, to have more unity in the country and less polarization, but B, to have the center-left have a greater chance of actually beating the center-right bloc in Israeli politics. So that's an additional challenge. I'm going to go quickly with you because I want to have a time for discussion. The current situation, right? And if you look at who won, who lost among the parties, even though they're relatively, I would say, even among the blocs, you have Shas, which people thought in its heyday, those of you who came to the Israeli Film Festival, we had a great movie, The Unorthodox, about the establishment of the Shas party, and in its heyday it had about 17 Knesset seats. People thought it might not reach the threshold and actually be able to make it in this election, but they have 8 seats, right? The Mizrahi Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox Party, and the United Torah Judaism has 8 seats. Together, 16 seats. The amount of seats for Ultra-Orthodox has grown. Now, on one hand, Ultra-Orthodox are becoming larger. They're getting more incorporated in the society, less isolated. So some of them are actually not listening to their rabbis and voting for other parties, but they still have 16 seats. Now, on one hand, Gantz could say, fine, no problem. There have been lots of times governments where ultra-Orthodox parties have joined labor governments in a coalition. These parties should be up for grabs, like either Gantz or Netanyahu, theoretically. They should be up for grabs. They're willing to go with whoever gives the most money, essentially, right, most of the time. So what's the problem? Anybody? Why is it easier then for Netanyahu? Why do people think, oh, Netanyahu will probably be the next prime minister because we're assuming they're going to go for Netanyahu, not with Gantz? Well, first, like maybe somebody else, because you know too much. Well, no, okay, now let my husband talk, yeah.
Could be wrong.
Yeah.
Military service.
Part of it's the military service question, right? So that, when Yair Lapid, who's in the Yesh Atid Central Party, he's part of this blue-white coalition. One of his main mantras in the 2013 government was one of the only governments in Israel history that did not include religious parties, right? And they were perceived as being very anti-religious, right? There's all this resentment in Israeli society that the ultra-Orthodox don't pay enough taxes, that everybody's paying taxes for their families with 8 children, that they don't serve in the military, etc., 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 right? So in 2013, there finally was a government that was going to take on civil marriage, service of ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox felt like they were under attack, right? Because they actually were changing, drafting ultra-Orthodox into the party. If you look at the blue-white platform, they include civil marriage, right? Right now, Israel, for those of you who don't know, has remnants of the Ottoman system, like Lebanon, where basically each religion is in charge of family matters, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish. It's the religious courts that decide marriage and divorce and burial and things like that, right? So there are a lot of more secular people in Israel who are saying, we don't want that, we want civil marriage, and that's on the blue-white platform. So here, blue-white has civil marriage, anathema to the ultra-Orthodox that now control it. They have Yael, the head of the Yesh Atid party, that was seen as completely attacking the religious community in the 2013 government. So basically, Yair Lapid is anathema to these ultra-Orthodox parties. So that's why they're going to, even though theoretically they could go with either one, they're more likely to go with Netanyahu, right? Then you have, as I said, Hadash Ta'al, which is, and the votes were down. By the way, usually Israelis vote more so than Americans, right? In the 50s, it would have like percentages in the 80s in terms of people voting. I think in the 90s it had percentages in the 70s%, and so forth. This year, I think it was 68%, and I think the most generous of how Americans voted in our last presidential election was 60%. So Israelis are bemoaning how, oh my God, fewer people are voting, and compared to how it used to be, it's something to be concerned about, but it's still significantly more than how many Americans are voting. Now, it used to be that sometimes in the early days that the Palestinian Israelis actually early on would mostly vote for Zionist parties actually, and would vote in very high percentages. But this year, it seems like it's maybe as much as 10% below the Jewish voters at around 50%. So maybe, you know, if you look at it compared to America, you could think, oh, it's not drastically bad, but if you look at, you know, disparity in the society, it's bad relatively speaking. And so that's part of the reason they lost votes, and it's partly because they're disaffected with their own leaders, who they feel aren't serving them. They're disaffected with these parties that are demonizing them. They feel disaffected from the nation-state law that the right Black Plus, where they talked about Israel being a Jewish state, which it has in its Declaration of Independence, but left out that it's also a democracy and a state for all its citizens, which is in the Declaration, which unnecessarily alienated people. The Druze, by the way, the non-Jews who serve in the Israeli military, they were voting mostly for Zionist parties. Blue-White Party, Meretz Party. Meretz has Druze in it. Blue-White has Druze in the list. Labor, you know, we talked about. Israel Beiteinu is originally the Russian party of Lieberman. Some people thought he might not even make the 3.25% threshold, but he did. Now, theoretically speaking, let's ask you know, Lieberman and Israel Beiteinu to back him, even though he's kind of more of a right party. Why? Israel Beiteinu are secular, and there's a huge amount of friction between Lieberman and Netanyahu. And Lieberman is ambivalent, you know, well, so it's not necessarily a given that you can't try to get Lieberman, and he's going to try to play that politics. The right-wing union, yeah, that's definitely not going to go with Gantz. And this is a new union between the Israel Home Party, which is kind of a settler party, the Bennett-headed, that was trying to appeal to Israeli broader society and economic issues. And also now these this former Kahanis in the Otzma party, which I try to be objective, but is pretty scary, you know, I think, because they're pretty racist, you know, pretty blatantly racist and problematic, perhaps in terms of inciting violence, which is why the Israeli Supreme Court years ago actually outlawed the party for its racism and incitement to violence. And now it's 2 members, it came to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court banned one of its leaders because they thought he's so racist and might incite violence, right? So this is an issue. You know, it could theoretically be possible that they could want the education ministry or justice ministry. Problematic, right? And then you have the Balad Yael that I talked about. Kulanu used to be Likud people who got fed up with Netanyahu and wanted to form their own party. They theoretically, there's so much friction between them and Netanyahu, and he says he won't back Netanyahu staying as prime minister if he's indicted. But theoretically, Gantz could try to pull him over, but it's not a given because they're center-right. You have Meretz, who of course is allied with Gantz, and then you have these three parties that at this point haven't made it. One is Hayamin HaChadash, or the New Right, which is Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, the head of Education Ministry and Justice Ministry right now, who are very right. They may, counting the next 250,000 votes, make it in, which would actually help Netanyahu form his coalition. You have Zehut, this crazy Moshe Feiglin. I shouldn't say crazy, but it's certainly a very different campaign that he ran to legalize marijuana on one hand, so he was getting people in Tel Aviv who are secular to support him, but on the other hand, he's for rebuilding a third temple and for settlements and for against the two-state solution. So it was crazy in terms of the people he was attracting, in terms of completely different ideologies that were somehow attracted to his libertarianism and pro-legalizing marijuana. And he did not make it, which probably Netanyahu was disappointed by. And Geshe was a former woman from Kulanu who formed her own centrist party, who wasn't able to make it, and maybe each one of them could have been trying to pull it. So I'll end here and open for questions. All I'll say is, it's likely, but not a given, that Netanyahu will form the coalition. It's possible, although not likely that there would be a unity government between the two. It's possible, though not likely, that in the count of 250,000 votes, Gantz gets an extra seat, or something happens, or is able to persuade others, but it's unlikely. But the new Netanyahu government might only last a year. Why? Because his hearings supposedly start July 10th, and he could be indicted within 6 to 12 months. And unless he passes some kind of legislation, which he'll try to do, saying that a sitting prime minister can stay as prime minister when he's indicted, that's what he's trying to do. But the feeling is that the Supreme Court would reject that and say, even if there's legislation saying, does it sound familiar in this country? Whether a leader can still be a leader when they're indicted. So those are the issues. So, we might have another election a year from now. Who knows? Any questions, critiques, things you want to discuss? Yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, how did the switching from making it like a 3.25%, like you said, to have a seat, how did that affect the bigger parties versus the smaller ones? And also, for the Arab Israeli citizens, is it hard for them to vote outside of the Arab parties? Because, do they feel subscribed to those two?
Those are both good questions. So theoretically, anytime you increase the voting threshold, it should help the bigger parties because it makes it more difficult for the smaller parties. So theoretically, it should help the bigger parties, and I think largely it does, unless they get to the situation, which always happens in Israeli politics, where they actually don't have enough. They have a quarter of the support of the population that need to form a coalition with others, and then they need those smaller parties to back them, right? So it was interesting, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, all the reflections on the election said, we don't know what's going to happen, because it could be because of this threshold that the smaller right parties get booted out, or the smaller left parties get booted out. And what happens depends on which of those parties get booted out, right? So in that sense, the votes for your party can increase, but your chances of forming a coalition could decrease because of the higher threshold that you get, right? And in terms of your second question, again, in the past, many Arab Israeli parties voted in high numbers for Zionist parties. Right now, the Druze do so. Other parties now mostly vote for one of the four Arab Israeli parties. So the majority votes for them, but not all of them. And certainly, Christian Arab Israelis vote in higher numbers, slightly higher numbers, for some Zionist parties, especially Meretz and sometimes Labor and Blue White. And you have some Bedouins, like depending on which village or which city you're looking at, voting for different Zionist parties. So there probably is some social pressure increasingly not to, or to not vote at all, but some do for Zionist parties, and some even vote for Likud, and some, I was looking at just today, some Arab Israelis are voting for Shas, which is kind of interesting. I mean, you know, since they're an ultra-Orthodox Jewish party, but I don't know if they think that, you know, they'll somehow be helping their communities more, or get some kind of, have the party leaders, you know, say kind of some kind of obligation that they will help them and so forth. So there is a mix, but increasingly there probably is pressure not to vote for Zionist parties. Else? Something that is confusing, something like what? Yeah.
How do evangelical Christians in this country, particularly the Midwestern and Southeastern United States, contribute to these parties in the political process?
Okay, so I think they mostly are backing center right, it seems like.
Or in favor.
Right? Are they in
or
favor?
sympathizing?
I don't know for sure, but it seems like, you know, sometimes they back whoever is leading the Israeli government, whether they're Labour or Likud, but certainly they have no problem backing Likud, and sometimes the settler parties, because some, not most evangelicals, but some evangelicals also contribute money to settlements in the West Bank at times too, so I don't want to make too many generalizations. I think as a whole, they'll support whatever Israeli government is. So they're there, whether they're from the left or the right, but certainly they have supported the right government in the past. But you bring up something that I didn't mention, which is kind of an elephant in the room that I should have mentioned, which is like, you know, Trump's support for Netanyahu. And in the last couple of weeks now, you look at how close this election is, right? Literally, how close this election is in some respects, right? Although some might argue it's not close in terms of forming the coalition. So one could argue Trump's support for Netanyahu, you know, if everything were equal, would not have a dramatic influence, I don't think. But given that it's so close, it could have made the difference, perhaps, right? Because what did Trump do, right? First, of course, earlier he puts the American embassy, at least formally, in Jerusalem, which most Israelis back, even though they might differ in terms of the timing and nature of how it was done. We can get into that. But then, right, 2 weeks ago, like to give Netanyahu a present, like literally like a gift on a silver platter for the election, before the election, he says the United States will recognize Israeli annexation of the Golan that happened in 1967, right? And he invites Netanyahu to the White House, gives him his full support right before the election. So of course Israelis, like what's been going on in Syria for the past few years, right? Who's right next to the Golan? The UN troops, some of them were forced to leave. You had al-Nusra there, which is like affiliated with Al-Qaeda. You had ISIS like somewhere near it. And now that the civil war seems to be closing, you have Hezbollah there on the border with Iranian bases in Syria, and Hezbollah on its other border with Lebanon. So many Israelis are thinking, oh my God, like if we had given the Golan to Syria, like who would be sitting on the Golan right now, like having the Shiites shooting down at Israeli farmers in the down like they did before 1967. Now, I think this is understandable, but this is a fear that's understandable that Netanyahu completely played into and that Israelis supported. Yeah, especially now, you better keep the Golan, right? So it's great that Netanyahu has this wonderful relationship with Trump. Now, ironically, Netanyahu himself was negotiating land for peace deals with Syria to give the Golan back to Syria in exchange for peace, at least most of the Golan, before 2011 when the civil war started, as Shimon Peres had, as Rabin had, as Barak had, right? So you had a whole strew of Israeli prime ministers who entered serious negotiations with Syria to enter a land for peace deal. So I'm kind of veering away, but what I would suggest is that Israel is in a land for peace formula, and if it's ever going to have peace with Syria, it's going to have to give up. But you have, and then what happened Monday? The day before the election, right? The day before the election, Trump gives Netanyahu another present, as if he didn't give him enough presents the day before. He's like, you know what, I'm going to give you another present. By the way, his pollster is Netanyahu's pollster. Trump's helping with his campaign. So what present did he give on Monday to Netanyahu? is the U.S. recognition that now the Iranian Republican Guards are going to be considered terrorists. Which you could argue they should do or shouldn't do, but the timing of it, the day before the Israeli election, was certainly supposed to be a gift to Netanyahu. Who else gave? What other world leader gave Netanyahu a gift the week before the elections? Putin. Right? What did Putin do? You know, Sophia?
I don't actually.
You do? Oh!
know.
So Putin, right? He, it's a horrible situation, but Israel had 3 bodies of killed soldiers that were missing since the 1982 war with Lebanon, right? So what is that, a 40-year long time?
And the Soviets were
Right?
backing
The
Saddam
families don't have the bodies.
Yeah.
They find the body in Syria, which Russia partially controls, which is wonderful. Like, it's heartbreaking for these families. But the timing and way it was done, inviting Netanyahu to Russia to get the clothes of the killed soldier, and then, basically the timing of it, I mean, it's a wonderful thing, unquestionably, right? But the timing of it was certainly to help Netanyahu. And just like Russia influenced the US election, Russia did it transparently and openly for the Israeli election, right? Then you had the Indian Prime Minister Modi celebrating the victory of Netanyahu. They have a close relationship. You have the Brazilian leader celebrating Netanyahu before the election, right? So Netanyahu can say, look, I've been prime minister for years. I have close relationships with the powerful world leaders. You're going to let this Gantz guy, who just doesn't have any experience, come in? Look at me. Look who's backing me. The world powers are backing me, right? So that was like a nice little gift, right? The day before election, the week before election, the 2 weeks before the election, right? And by the way, in terms of American politics, it just contributes, there's been this solid bipartisan support for Israel for decades, and this whole Netanyahu and Trump helping each other with each other elections so blatantly is arguably increasing the deterioration or the questioning or the challenge to bipartisan support for Israel in the U.S. Yeah.
That was actually going to lead into my question. What do you think the election results will have to do with American opinion of Israel moving forward?
Well, it depends partially. Look, I don't want to be too alarmist, right? Because on one hand, I do want to recognize that Israel and the U.S., I think, have a very solid relationship based on many common interests and values that I think will transcend any particular reader. I do think that, and if you look at American favorability rates towards Israel, they're like at 70%. They're like for countries like France and England. I don't know. They're like top 10 countries of friendliness and favorability of the 194 countries in the world. You have you have so much there in terms of intelligence cooperation, military cooperation. It is still arguably the only democracy in the Middle East, or despite the challenges to its democracy, it's still more democratic than Turkey. So I don't want to be too alarmist, right? So I want to set that outside. Nevertheless, right? Trump and Netanyahu are such lightning rods in terms of the politics of their own society, right? As we all know, people either love Trump or they hate him, right? And the more Trump embraces so closely and warmly Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, the more people who hate Trump are going to be like, wait a minute, I hate Trump. I hate anything that anybody who Trump likes, I'll hate them. I hate Trump so much. Anything that he does must be bad and wrong, and I'll have to oppose, right? I mean, look at how we feel about Trump, right? So is that going to help in the long term how people feel about Israel? Yeah, I think it's going to affect it, and you even see among the Democratic candidates criticism of Netanyahu, although not Israel. That being said, I think that most Americans, even if they criticize Netanyahu, still generally support Israel, even if they critically support Israel. So I don't want to be too alarmist about it, even though it does present a challenge. Yeah. Yes.
Do you fear that the continuous movement towards the right-wing parties will deteriorate that in the future?
Oh, yeah, I think it's possible that it would, and I think we are already seeing kind of a real challenge to it by a party that's only existed for less than 2 months. So now, if there could be an election another year, and they actually get their act together and become better politicians and make good strategic choices, in confluence with perhaps a new leadership in the United States as well, you could see opportunities for change. And there's an article I recently wrote that I discussed a little bit about it. So my dad has written a book on the Labor Party, on several editions of it. And he was analyzing why the Labor Party, which had been the party ruling the country for 30 years, why they faded in the late 70s. And there were three things he points to in one of his articles. One is that they started using the ideology more in a ritualistic way, as opposed to kind of a genuine, deep way. Two, that you can attribute some of their success of the Labor Party in this instance to the ineffectiveness of the opposition as opposed to their own effectiveness. And three, political scandals. Now, if you look at those three conditions in today's world, some of what I've talked about, right, is why the center-left hasn't been able to challenge Netanyahu in a bigger way is because of their own ineffectiveness, rather than because of the effectiveness. There is ideological deterioration in the Likud party, right? I mean, you know, the party that has been for greater Israel and keeping the West Bank for decades, since 2009, Netanyahu, at least rhetorically and officially, is for a two-state solution. And Trump, by the way, the additional gift, so that's, and I'll get back to Trump. The third condition, right, political scandal, the political scandals in the 1970s were child play next to the indictments that Netanyahu faces today, right? So you could look at conditions where the Likud has been in power for so long that it becomes arrogant, it becomes ineffective, its ideology wanes, and there definitely could be a challenge. The other gift that Trump gave Netanyahu is saying, I will only publicly give out my peace plan for Israelis and Palestinians after the election. Why after the election? To help Netanyahu. Why will it help Netanyahu? Because if the U.S. even hints that Israel is going to have to do anything, concede anything, compromise on anything before an election, that will make life more difficult for Netanyahu in trying to recruit votes away from even parties to the right of him. So if that's a gift for Netanyahu, which it was, so that's like the third or fourth or fifth or sixth gift that Trump bestowed on him, right? Then that means that something will be expected of Israel, even under this new peace deal, that it will make it very hard for Netanyahu to say no to, right? So that gives an opening of some kind in terms of coalition formation and changes in Israeli politics.
So, in response to the question about how will U.S. voters respond to the rightward shift in Israel in this election, it seems to me as I look at the numbers, is it actually a rightward shift? Because if you take out Shas and United Torah Judaism, the left, actually not even center left, but the left minor parties add up to much more, 5 more votes than the solidly further right-wing parties that they do. Right, if you look at, it's like 15, if you look at Israel Beiteinu, right-wing and Lano, they're like 6 votes fewer than Meretz, Balad, Yael, and Hadash Ta'al, and Labour. Right, so actually, there isn't really a strong rightward shift in that. It's Likud and the Kol Lavan, and then you actually have a stronger left if you take out the ultra-Orthodox parties, which you can't really call like rightist nationalist parties. They're interested in something else.
Right. So depending on how you define right and left, right, which it could be more of a realignment within the blocks than a change among the blocks in the recent election, right? And we could argue that. And certainly if you look at past this election, what does this portend for future trends in Israeli society, which was Ben was also asking about. It doesn't necessarily mean a permanent shift. It means that this year, Shas and UTJ are, having revenge on Yair Lapid in blue and white, but that may change, right, in a future election in terms of who they align with, right?
But I also think rhetorically, as people say, as we are talking about the elections, if people are saying, wow, look at Israel, there's this incredible rightward shift, I think that's actually based on a misperception and a misunderstanding of how these parties work.
Right. And also part of the argument with, things have shifted to the right, is much of the right has shifted to the center, right? And so this is what I also remind people of, that actually a lot of the center parties are formed by people who used to be in the Likud, who now support a two-state solution, and formed either Kadima or Blue and White or what have you, or Yesh Atid, and certainly, and even parties like Israel Beiteinu, he has some problematic statements, but ultimately he says he's for a two-state solution, right? So, which 20 years ago the right parties would never think. So if you look at some of their stances, certainly they have lost people to centrist parties, and even the head of the Food Party for the last 10 years, at least rhetorically, saying he's for a two-state solution. So on one hand, there's a rightward shift. On the other hand, the right has also shifted to the center, right? Sophia, I don't know if you were going to say something. You maybe go first. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was going to respond to a previous question. Well, one of the things that deeply concerns me is that traditionally U.S. foreign policy was always nonpartisan, and partly as a result of the polarization in the United States and Congress, and partly as a result of a deliberate intervention by Netanyahu in American politics, and then the cozy alliance between Bibi Netanyahu and Trump. There is an increasingly, well, there's the progressive wing of the Democrat Party has been labored anti-Israeli, and the notion of, well, I mean, there's an inherent anti-Semitism on both extremes. You know, the white nationalists that Trump seems to be very comfortable with, and the far left of the progressive wing of the Democrats. There's increasingly signs of anti-Semitism, which again introduces an element of political rancor on and affects the relations, I think, between Israel and the United States.
No, that's true, and some people read articles about whether eventually the Democratic Party will become like the Labour Party in England, and all kinds of things about that, and certainly they feed each other, and certainly the bipartisanship is being eroded partly because of Netanyahu, partly in part from Netanyahu. That being said, like it has always been the case sometimes, just to take a step back from also my own subjectivity, that different American governments have tried to influence different Israeli elections and vice versa. So, right, so you had, of course, most Democratic presidents in the United States favoring Labour Party leaders in Israel, the 1992 election and the 1999 election, and being vocal about that. So it's not like U.S. presidents have never tried to influence Israeli elections, but I think never in this blatant a way with such leaders that emit such strong feelings one way or another, right? Yeah.
Well, Megan could maybe describe some of the differences or like even similarities between Netanyahu and Gantz in terms of like the relationship with Palestine or like a two-state solution.
I think that's a really good question. So I don't think they're like at different ends of the extreme, but I think there are real differences. So I think that Netanyahu rhetorically has said he's for a two-state solution. I don't know for sure, but I think somewhere he has said things that makes one think that he actually realizes that eventually, someday, if you want to retain a Jewish majority democracy,